Hello and welcome. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker, and in today's video I'm going to be discussing when to slow play your hands. All right. Very quickly, for those of you who are not sure what slow playing is or maybe confused, it has nothing to do with taking lots of time over decisions. All right. So playing in a slow manner, that's not slow playing. Slow playing is a poker term, very similar or exactly the same as trapping. So if you hear those two phrases, they're pretty much indistinguishable. And what slow playing actually is playing a strong hand weakly. So whilst you could slow play pre-flop, if you limp in with aces, that's a form of slow playing. Most of the time we're referring to play around the flop stage and through into the turn. And so what's happening is we flop something strong and then we check or call rather than betting or raising, in the hope that we trap our opponent into thinking we're weak, so we win more chips later in the pot. Okay, that's what slow playing is. It's playing a strong hand weakly. Now, what is a strong hand? Well, it depends on the circumstances, but for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume we're playing in a sort of normal cash game situation where you've got around 100 big blinds. So a strong hand might be defined as flopping 2-pair or better. All right, and that goes for most forms of the game. If you're playing in a situation with very few chips, so short stacked situations, this is different. And flopping top pair is a very strong hand. But here, 2-pair or better is pretty good. Now the aim with any strong hand is to make a big pot, and that should always be your thought when you flop something big. You should be thinking, right, how can I extract the maximum value from this situation? And it can be very tempting. It can be very, very tempting to say to yourself, I don't want to bet here because he's going to fold. I think he's going to fold really often. I'm going to lose my opportunity to win a big pot. So why not just check? We'll see the next card. Maybe he'll catch up. And maybe I'll make some chips on the turn or the river. And sometimes that's exactly the right thought process. But actually, by playing the hand slowly, it's preventing you from building the pot, because a pot takes time to build. And if you lose the momentum on the flop, then by the turn, the pot's still very small and you've got less opportunity to win a really big pot. So slow playing is usually counterproductive to your aim of winning a big pot or a massive pot. All right. So with that in mind, you should usually be playing strong hands in an aggressive manner. You should usually be thinking about betting and about raising. These should be your default actions when you flop a strong hand. Most poker players are slow playing way too often, or at least a little bit too often. And it all comes down to this psychological thought of, oh yes, but what if he folds? And usually we're over concerned about this. Okay, if he folds, he probably had nothing anyway. We weren't going to make any money probably anyway. All right, so you're better off going for the aggressive option and trying to build the pot from the flop stage onwards. Now, having said that, let's think about when it is right to slow play. Okay, and there are certain circumstances which make slow playing a good strategy. Firstly, if you're against a single opponent, then it's more attractive to consider slow playing, because you're going to make him fold. If you bet aggressively, you are going to make him fold, 30, 40, 50% of the time, roughly. Okay, so you're looking for a single opponent. You're also looking for an aggressive opponent, because ideally what you want is if you make a passive action, he's going to then bet, right? That's what you're looking for, because he can build the pot for you, throw chips in with weak hands and complete bluffs if he senses weakness in you. If your opponent's passive, slow playing is one of the worst mistakes you can make, because your opponent may be sat there with a strong hand like top pair, you flopped a set, and suddenly you check flop, you check turn, and you're at the river, you make a small bet, okay, you win a few chips, and you lost your opportunity to win a monster pot. So always make sure that your opponent is an aggressive opponent, or at least you perceive your opponent to be aggressive. If you're not sure, I would tend to err on the side of playing aggressively yourself. The third point here is, so if you're facing a really large bet or raise, and this does happen, right? You get people making oversized bets or pot-sized bets, and you think to yourself, well, okay, normally I would raise here, but it feels as though my opponent's being super aggressive. Maybe I'll just call and let my opponent then continue to bleed chips on the turn. That can be the right decision. And the final point is very important, and that is that we're looking for dry boards, because dry boards are the ones where our opponents haven't connected very often with the flop. So it's much less likely that they're going to continue to the turn and the river. Dry boards tend to get more folds, so it makes more sense to either bet small or to check. Okay. I also put that at the bottom, so when there are very few danger cards, and you know this is relevant because there are certain types of boards where there's quite a lot of bad cards that can come down for your strong hand. It can still get overtaken, right, by flushes and straights and things like that. So you need to think a little bit about how many turn and river cards are going to hurt you and how safe is your hand. If you flop quads, you know, there's not going to be any danger cards, I hope. I think in 20 years of playing poker, I've only lost twice with quads. So it doesn't happen very often. So bear all these points in mind when you're considering whether or not to slow play. Now I'm going to give you a quick example of an opportunity for slow playing. So this is a cash game scenario facing an aggressive villain. So pre-flop, the villain has raised in position and we've called with pocket twos. Okay, perhaps we're in the big blind. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this discussion. Flops jack 4-2, we check from out of position, and then the villain makes a bet as expected. He's continuation betting. As an aggressive player, we're expecting this with a high frequency, and then we decide just to call rather than to raise. This is a good spot for just calling because our opponent's probably not hit the board, and this is a dry board with very few dangers on it. The turn is a 4, which completes a full house for our hand. Hero checks, villain bets, and then again we decide just to call. We're trapping, we're trying to make our opponent make a mistake. We don't believe he's necessarily got something. We could raise here, but then we'd be very much dependent on our opponent holding a big pocket pair or a jack. So the turn card comes down a 4, completing a full house for us, but probably not improving our opponent's hand. It hasn't really changed much in terms of his range that he arrived at the flop with is still probably pretty much the same. So we're just going to hope that he bets again as an aggressive player. We check, he bets, and we decide once again just to call. We could raise here. We could gamble on him having an overpair or a jack. I mean, there are very few 4s and 2s in his range. So we're thinking he's most likely got nothing, and therefore just call. River comes down at ace, which is of course a great card for us. It does complete an unlikely full house that beats us, an ace 4. But apart from that, we're not really worried about anything. This is a good card. It's likely to have improved his hand, and we now look to extract some value by betting. Our villain calls and shows ace 3. An alternative strategy here would be to check raise that river card. It risks our opponent checking behind, but he's an aggressive player. If we think he's probably going to bet, then it might be something to go for on the river here. And this is an example of where you might choose to slow play. If you're enjoying this video so far, click the like button and hit subscribe, and you'll be notified when new content is released. Now, I want to now talk about things to avoid. All right, so when you're thinking about slow playing, consider whether it's a multi-way pot. If it is, then you should tend not to slow play. A little bit depends on the strength of your hand and how easily overtaken it is. So if it's a hand that's really, really strong, then you might choose to still slow play the hand. All right, but even in that scenario, it's not the default play. All right, it is an alternative strategy. If your opponent is passive, we talked about this before. If your opponent is passive, slow playing is a disaster. You shouldn't be doing it. You need to be leading the betting, forcing your opponent into difficult decisions. The bottom 2 points, so if the board is wet or if the board is ace high, I don't recommend slow playing in these situations. I think that when the board is ace high, you want to be betting into it and hoping your opponent has an ace. In situations where an ace is prevalent in your opponent's range, which will be quite frequently in most formats of the game. If you're playing with really, really wide ranges, this point is less relevant. But the point about the board being wet is more key. When the board's wet, your opponent will have connected with the board more frequently. And for that reason, you should be cautious of slow playing. Now, I wanted to round up this video by discussing briefly shorter stacked slow playing. You are able to do a bit more slow playing in shorter stacked spots. I think this is useful for tournament players in particular who are going to be facing this situation more often. Now, I recommend, if you're not familiar with stack to pot ratio as a measurement, I would recommend becoming familiar with this. So do some research. We have bag loads of content on this at Transform My Poker. But it's a useful way of gauging your commitment level to the pot in a shorter stack situation. A strong hand is defined very differently in short stack spots. So sometimes even an ace high might be strong, but any pair, middle pair, top pair, these sorts of hands can sometimes be strong enough for you to commit to, and in certain situations strong enough for you to just slow play the hand. It's much easier to get all of the chips in when there's very few chips left. So you can actually slow play very, very easily and still get the money in, right? So trapping doesn't have some of the disadvantages that it has in deeper stack spots. So I think it makes more sense to slow play frequently when you are short stacked. But having said that, you should still be looking for aggressive opponents and avoiding the passive ones. And I think that that's a good note to end this video on. Now, if you've enjoyed this, there's free training available. If you click the link below this video, you can sign up for free tournament training. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker. Thank you very much for listening.